this panel is supported to some extent by the Rural Policy Learning Commons, so let me give you the 2-minute version of what we're all about. This is a project that is a partnership project, so we've got resources to bring people together, to get people talking to one another, to build capacity in activities that people are engaged in, but we don't have a big chunk of funds, for example, to support research itself. So it's all about connecting. It's an international project. We have at present about 90 different participants, some of them institutional, some of them individual, in 9 or so countries. We're eager to be discovering new things that people are doing and somehow or other finding ways in which we can leverage and help to facilitate the kinds of activities that you're involved in. Some of the issues that are currently on our list, our partners, are around food and waste related issues, and particularly in Italy, the international labor mobility. There's another team working on mobility. Impact of alternative agricultural environmental policies on Irish farmers is another area. Food, energy, water, climate, Nexus, we call it, how those things are all coming together and having impacts on each other. Food and beverage processing industries. So that the kinds of themes basically are looking at rural related themes, but the details, the topics depend on where the needs are and where we feel we should put our energy. It's built on a number of key principles. That is, we attempt to find the people and the groups and the centers who are working on rural and northern related issues and support their activities rather than try and duplicate them or divert the energy. We don't want to draw away energy from those. We attempt to facilitate communication among researchers, policymakers, practitioners, and citizens regarding insights and issues relating to rural and northern people and places. We like to think that we can help to build the next generation, the capacity of the next generation of researchers, policymakers, practitioners, and citizens, and provide easy and open access to all who share our objectives. That is, if you give a little, you get access to everything, and it's a formula that has worked well for us over the years. So I invite you to explore our site. Let us know if there's something of interest that you have, that you see there. Propose an initiative if you don't find it, or let us know how we can help you with your own deliberations. And just one thing to mention, which often comes as a surprise to our international colleagues, we have Canadian money, but we can spend it on people who are not Canadians. And I know that it took us a long time to convince our partners that that really was true. Okay, by way of introduction to the panel, I just want to outline a framework and a set of assumptions that I've kind of used when considering its development here. First of all, certainly in the Canadian context, urban places will increase their dominance of Canadian society and politics. Rural and urban places, nevertheless, are highly interdependent, and they'll continue to be so in the future. I'm taking that as an assumption. And also, I would assume that rural prosperity depends on understanding that this interdependency and positioning rural people and places strategic with respect to it. I've found it useful to think about this interdependence with respect to 4 broad features of social organization. These are 4 ways in which changes in rural settings will have impacts on the urban settings. Our changes in urban settings will have impacts on rural. It's what I would consider the basic meaning of interdependence. So the first is the one that's most often discussed, and that is via trade and exchanges of goods, services, finance, or people. And sometimes it's direct, as with farmers markets and commuting or labor markets. And often, certainly in the Canadian context, it's indirect via other nations or complex downstream transformations. This is to be expected in our commodity-dependent economy in Canada, where about 83% of our positive balance of trade in goods and services is due to the export of rural products, agriculture, forestry, energy, and so on. The second broad way in which we're interdependent is through the institutions we share. This includes national, provincial, regional, and some municipal institutions, both formal and informal, that organize activities for both urban and rural people. From health, education, welfare, to scouts, religions, and families, and so on, where the policies developed in and for one place affect the other. And the third area is the environment. Over the past 50 years, we've learned a great deal about the interdependence of all regions with respect to the environment. In fact, if we can build it up, we can see that for the whole earth. And it's also be dramatically seen on a regional scale. The environmental footprint, for example, for Toronto is 280 times its formal size, about a third the size of Ontario. The footprint is largely in rural areas: food, water, pollution, processing, waste management, and so on. And the final area that's often not treated at all is with respect to identity. And I'm using here identity to refer to the ways in which we see ourselves, who we think we are, what our friends and families are like, the places we grew up, worked, visited, wished to visit, and the things we value about ourselves, our networks, neighborhoods, cities, regions, and country. I've asked the panel to address two questions arising from this basic rural-urban interdependence. First is, in what ways are rural and urban places interdependent? We should do the job of trying to identify the nature of that interdependence. And second, how can we develop more beneficial rural-urban relationships under those conditions? So, Joshua Barrett will examine the sensitivity of rural leaders in BC, Ontario, Quebec, and Newfoundland to the four components of rural-urban interdependence, which I've outlined. And Chris Southcott will summarize past and future trends in rural-urban relations in Canada's territorial north. His comparisons with Alaska and Greenland provide useful comparisons to highlight how those relations are linked to decolonization. And John Devlin will speak to us briefly about the challenge to those who would answer the second of the panel's two questions with reference to self-regulated markets. Inspired by the work of Polanyi, he reflects on what types of policy regimes will be necessary to help rural places respond to the looming urban crises of water, energy, and food. And finally, Lars Hallström will make use of provincial and national surveys to demonstrate the importance of rural-urban relations for the community capacity of mid to small-sized rural communities. He'll examine how insights from social capital, network, and innovation theory can improve our understanding of how rural and urban communities are interrelated. I've asked the panelists to keep their presentations short so we'll have plenty of time for discussion and development of the issues. And I'm particularly interested in exploring what these results imply for strategic action in the future for researchers, practitioners, and the policymakers among us. So I'll first of all call upon Joshua to present his material, and I will, in the process, get his slides.
All right, well, thanks, Bill. Thanks, everybody here. Again, thank you to the RPLC for helping make this happen. It's been great to be involved with this initiative. So, the popular media often represent rural and urban places as fundamentally in conflict. That urbanization and resulting political tensions has certainly extended this view with competing demands for resources and tensions, and that city regions and high-profile urban metropoles are described as engines of growth. And so research has suggested that Canada's regional development problem is now an urban-rural rather than a regional or provincial one, and that this debate seldom reflects the fundamental interdependence of rural and urban places, however, and remains relatively uninformed regarding the empirical evidence demonstrating that interdependence. And so the presentation that I'll be providing today is a paper myself and Bill and Kelly Vodden, who couldn't be here today, is really the first of the kind to look in depth at these types of interdependencies in Canada between rural and urban places. So when we're considering new regionalism, first of all, we did this as a broad spectrum. So I'll just briefly introduce some of these core tenets and focus on rural and urban relationships. But certainly we were looking at governance, collaborative multi-level governance, which can be used to describe a variety of institutions, actors related to government, social and economic issues. Integrated versus sectoral or single objective approaches, which involves regional development through multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary perspectives. Place-based development, which seeks to reveal, utilize, and enhance the unique natural, physical, or human capacity endowments present within a particular location. Fostering knowledge flow, learning, and innovation. And certainly rural interactions and interdependence, which is what we're doing here, learning about today. So just to paint the picture a bit about our project, certainly when we consider Canada at a federal level, and certainly at in some cases a provincial level, there's been decades of regional development change when it comes to policy and practice that has been involved, certainly in our institutions. Canadian geography, our country is the second largest country in terms of landmass, but with 35 million people, there's a lot of distance and density involved with that as well. And at the time of our research, there's been little cross-provincial comparative analysis ongoing. And so what we've done is identified 5 particular case study contexts. Number 1 is Eastern Ontario, in Ontario, of course. Number 2 is the Gander, Quebequeg, New West Valley region in Newfoundland, Labrador. Number 3 is the Kootenays region in British Columbia. Number 4 is the Rimouski area in Quebec. And number 5 is the Great Northern Peninsula, Newfoundland, Labrador. So for this particular research, we used 102 interviews and compared them across different jurisdictions. The project as a whole, when we consider more provincial interviews and master's and PhD dissertations, we actually have much more data. So there's certainly a lot of data we have considering the issues that we are addressing here. So I'm not going to go over this because Bill did a fine job addressing the framework that we're using here, but just to recap, certainly trades and exchanges are the most common focus within rural-urban interdependencies. Again, institutions and environment also important, and yet for this particular context in rural-urban interdependencies, identity has certainly an area that we could improve our research focus on, and perhaps policy as well, as I'll point out in a few moments. So when we consider how our rural-urban relationships are perceived and managed, from this data we see certainly the institutional interdependencies are most often referenced here, 54% across the board. This is consistent within each of our particular regions as well. Trades and exchanges, again, relatively high across each region, 27%. But environment and identity are relatively low. So for this presentation, I'll be focusing on institutions and trade, but I'll discuss environment and identity and perhaps moving forward this at the end. So when we consider the institutional linkages, government is the highest between the interdependencies that we've looked at. It's relatively spread across all four institutional linkages that we looked at. Third sector, again, is another high aspect. And so when we look at the interviews, many interviewees discussed that the federal government is a major funder for different initiatives that they were a part of. Other interviewees suggested that government policy may not overly be supported over pockets of communities. They think there might be more of an urban bias going on. And again, the geography issue could be potentially difficult when accessing different institution services. And so it's interesting to note the relationship of these interdependencies between the government, in particular the federal government. However, on this scale, the local federal linkages are very low. Local international linkages or interdependencies are actually higher than local federal. And this, we've seen this happen prior to in the new rural economy project. So certainly this aspect is very interesting and fascinating. Local interdependencies, no surprise that these are very strong, active, going on, as well as local and provincial relationships are also active as well. When we look at trades and exchanges, a lot of the exchanges occurring more or less intangible, perhaps a transfer of information. This can be seen a lot through transfer at local workshops or meetings. A lot of this exchanges aspect has to do with mobility and this distance factor, perhaps a rural communities needing to access urban services, traveling to do that. A lot of this is also through employment at urban centers. A lot of up to 70% and more the population of rural communities actually employed in more urban areas. And so these are some of the exchanges that were certainly evident throughout our research as well. But again, we see them all across the board, whether it's finances, services, people, goods. These are certainly active exchanges throughout. So just some key messages here. I know I just put up a lot of numbers for you, so I apologize. Just to recap. We see that when it comes to local and federal institutional relationships, there is a bit of a disconnect between rural-urban interdependencies. This is not necessarily a new finding, but it certainly reaffirms what we've learned in the past as well. Trade and exchanges are certainly important bases. Perceived interdependence within the private sector. This can be seen with economic objectives as certain points of reference. Institutional relationships are important in public sector discussions. This can be seen through ways of general policies and programs that perhaps misrepresent local conditions going on. And again, we've seen, while there's certainly interdependencies here, there's also some tensions forming between rural and urban areas when we consider policies and put into place, perhaps whether it's medical policy favoring more urban areas and putting more of a strain on the rural, perhaps needing to travel or accommodations, what have you. This is certainly going on. And yet, throughout all of this research and data, there certainly has been just a little focus on the environment and identity-based interdependencies. And perhaps this is a result of local leaders who may not feel that this is necessary or important for them. But this could certainly be an interesting perspective to look at some of the policy implications of this moving forward and how some of these interdependencies can be more recognized or create more importance, because we have learned that these are certainly important aspects moving forward as well. So thank you. Looking forward to the discussion at the end, and I think Chris is coming up next.
asking about whether the people were asked about whether there were relationships or interdependencies, so that if the federal government is making laws and rules and things for a place, they might not see that as an interdependency, whereas it might be a one-way relationship. So I'm just wondering about the method here.
Well, we certainly, whether it was, if it was mentioned throughout, I think we would certainly consider that there is and it was occurring. So, I think, in terms of the mentions, I mean, if they mentioned if there was a positive or negative relationship, if it was mentioned, we would consider that as a, yeah.
They were marked as items, and then subsequent analysis looked at whether they were positive or negative. So these were treated as separate issues. Other questions of clarification? Okay. Great. I'll set you up. Chris.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bill. Before I start, I just want to thank Bill for organizing this. One of the things that I've really appreciated over the past few years as being part of the RPLC project that Bill leads is that as someone who works in the far north of Canada, it's often very difficult for us to have contact and good communication with those doing rural research, which is of relevance to people living in the far north. And so the RPLC network project has enabled that, and I want to thank Bill for the work that he's doing to allow us to have this conversation. I don't have the data that Joshua has, so what I'm going to talk about briefly is the general trends in the Canadian territories in terms of rural-urban. And in doing that, hopefully talk about the linkages that Bill pointed out, and I was sort of struck by the notion of identity, which is particularly important when you're talking about rural and urban linkages in the Canadian territories. So first of all, one of the first things that one can state is that according to some definitions of rural, there are no rural areas in the Canadian territories. There's been no rural areas since the 1970s. As some of you may know, from the 1950s to the 1970s, all of the Indigenous communities that lived on the land previous to the 1950s were centralized into settlements during that period. The last of these occurred in the early 70s. So everybody lives in a city or in a town. So everybody is urban from that perspective. Of course, there are now many definitions of rural, and so what is developed is a definition of urban as being the largest, the urban area for people living in the territory, I think, is their urban capital, the largest community. So the three urban areas of the territories are Whitehorse in Yukon, Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories, and perhaps to a lesser extent Inuvik in the Northwest Territories, Iqaluit in Nunavut, and perhaps to a lesser extent Rankin in the Northwest Territories. So these are the sort of the urban areas compared to the other areas, the other communities. I should start out by pointing out that for those who work in the far north, one of the key questions in terms of the rural-urban trends is the question of whether or not the movement into settlements was a voluntary movement or whether it's coerced. And this is an ongoing debate. There was a consensus that emerged in the 90s that it was a coerced movement. The government had organized it. But since then, there's been other studies that tend to show that perhaps there was more voluntary movement than had previously been thought. So I don't want to talk about that today, but just to let people know that that's a discussion that's ongoing in terms of the rural-urban debate. So one thing that people in the territories are assuming is going to happen is that you're going to have urbanization in the territories, because that's what's happened over the past 20 years in Alaska and in Greenland, two areas that are very comparable to the Canadian territories. So over the past 20 years, what we've seen is the process of urbanization. In fact, one of there, there was if you look at what are the trends in the circumpolar north, urbanization is seen to be one of those trends. But that's not really a strong trend in the Canadian territories, and that's something that puts the territories somewhat different from what's happening in Alaska and in Greenland, and I'll talk about that in a little while. One of the big trends that exists is you have a decline in the non-Indigenous resource communities. If you look at, and I'll show you a graph of the population changes of all the communities in the territories, the biggest declines have been in primarily non-Indigenous communities. So the biggest decline was in the town of Faro. Between 1991 and 2011, the biggest decline was in the town of Faro in the Yukon, where it went from 1,200 to 300 people. The second biggest was the town of Nanisivik, which was primarily non-Indigenous community in the far north, which went from 300 to 0. And then you have Watson Lake, which is primarily Indigenous, non-Indigenous in the Yukon, which has seen decline, and Fort Smith in the Northwest Territories. So it's those communities, the non-Indigenous communities, where you see decline. In terms of the Indigenous communities, you see some decline, but the declines you see tend to be due to redistribution, movements of people. So for example, the settlement of land claims in the Yukon under the final agreement of the Yukon final agreements, which are ongoing, there's still 3 that haven't settled their land claim. You tend to have resettlement once those are settled. And so when you see decline in a community, it's more of a redistribution of a population as opposed to a movement of people to an urban area. And as I said, the trends in Canada differ from Alaska and Greenland. In those two communities, one of the biggest problems they've seen is this urbanization, and in particular the urbanization of the young female population from the smaller communities, the villages as they call them in Alaska, into the larger urban areas of Alaska. So that's one of the biggest problems, and in Greenland as well. And to the point where in Greenland they're very much concerned that that's going to lead to the end of these villages, because there are going to be no women. The men are still there, but the women are leaving the communities as concerned. We don't see that trend in Canada. We don't see, in fact, we see more men leaving the community than women going to larger the centers. But the men are going primarily for one reason. They're going to prisons in the capital of the larger cities. So in terms of movement from people from the smaller villages, it's more men going than women, but those men are going as prisoners. But often they don't go back because the village doesn't want them back, they find it too difficult to return. So that's an issue. A couple of years ago, we did an analysis of the rural-urban changes, such as they are from the comparison of population growth from the smaller communities to the larger communities. And so there is no relationship between the size of the community and growth. So you don't have the larger urban areas growing faster than the smaller ones. You have the urban areas, the major urban capitals growing, but there are other sort of small communities that are growing as well. So you don't have that sort of thing. The major determinants of whether your community is going to grow is the percentage of your population under 20, the percentage of your population that's Aboriginal, and the percentage of your population that's employed. Those are the 3 main variables in explaining whether your community is going to grow or not. So it's not an urban, rural. And so in turning, one of the things that when you're talking about rural, urban, and the territories, a lot of time is spent on why is the situation in Canada different from Alaska and in Greenland. Especially Greenland, where it's the same people, basically, the Inuit, and in Alaska as well, you have, the Athabascan people share the same culture. Why is there a difference? And So one of the challenges is to, when we're looking at those rural-urban linkages, is to explain why those linkages are different in Alaska and Greenland from Canada. And I don't have an answer for that. Some suggest that it's just that Canadians are because Canadian contact, intensive contact, occurred later. That's why, you know, but it will happen. It's sort of like the demographic transition. So it's just so many people believe that, you know, we will see a stage where women will start leaving the smaller communities and moving to the larger centers. It's just that in Canada, the contact, the intensive contact period came much later than in Alaska or in Greenland. Others say that no, the new land claims that exist, the decolonization process that's occurring in northern Canada is different from that that's occurring in Greenland and especially in Alaska. And that is influencing the situation of women in the smaller communities. Martha Dowsley and I did a project in the North Baffin Island communities where we found that women had very little desire to move from their smaller communities because they believe that under the new land claim, economic opportunities will flow to them in their communities. Of course, under the new land claims agreement, you know, decentralization is one of the aspects of that there will be no centralization of political jobs and government jobs in the center. It will be decentralized. Plus, there is the constant discussion of mines. And so with those potential new economic opportunities, that women are, there's little likelihood for women to start leaving in the near future. And then there may be other reasons that we don't know, but I think we're out of time. But one thing is that, you know, when Bill President's thing, that the one thing that people, when you talk to people who are in Iqaluit, they're say in Iqaluit, in the regional capital, or even moved to Ottawa, where you have quite an important Inuit population from Nunavut in Ottawa. They're in these communities, they're still linked to their home communities. You know, they're only in these places temporarily. They haven't made a move. They're just, well, I have to go down here to work for a while, but, you know, I'm still linked to I'm still from Gulen. You know, I'm still from these communities. I'm just living here doing this work, but then the idea is that that'll still be my home. So that's the identity issue which Bill raised, I think, is very important in the North.
University, Netherlands. What we know from Iceland, you didn't mention it, but there is also the move of women from these local villages to away to towns and everything. And that was very much related to the very masculine environment, social environment of those villages. And probably it's the same in Greenland because you talk about fishery villages and things like that. So does this, let's say, this masculine environment, is that also a situation which you find in these places, or is that different? Because there could be a declination, of course. I would refer to the work of Bjornson and Torrensen about Iceland. Should I stay? Should I go?
Yeah, one of the things that differentiates Greenland and Alaska is you know, well, I'm not when you ask women in Greenland, I'm not interested in hunting or trapping. So that sort of issue, which of interest is to men, it's not interest to me. In our studies in Nunavut, women are still interested in subsistence activities. So they're still interested in that land. And they don't, I think, yet perceive it as being a masculine thing. I think the women in the smaller communities in Baffin are still they're the most educated. They're often very prominent in all of the jobs, the administrative jobs, political jobs. So I don't think they yet see their communities as being masculine dominated. But I know that that's the case in Greenland and in Alaska. It doesn't seem to be the case in North
Yes.
What does Aklavik mean?
Okay.
I got the word up there, Aklavik.
Oh, Aklavik, oh, sorry, that's the community, that's one of the only Inuit dominated communities that's seen a decline is the town of Aklavik. And the Aklavik is the community that was the original community for Inuvik. They've been trying to get people to move from Aklavik because it's prone to flooding all the time. And they built, because Aklavik floods every year, they built Inuvik about 20 miles away on higher land. And so one of the things that's happening is the older people stay in Aklavik, but as the older people die, the community is decreasing. So that's one of the biggest communities, indigenous communities, where you see a decline in population. But it's sort of an anomaly. It's not.
Thank you. John Devlin. Okay, I will set your material up. John, thanks very much, Chris.
Great, okay, thanks, Bill. Okay, so this is a change of pace, certainly. This is quite an overarching, conceptual, non-empirical conversation. And what I was moved to think about a little bit was my interest in Carl Polanyi's work on great transformation and large historical change, and trying to link that up with what we were interested for this session, which is urban and rural relationships of some sort. And I'll be direct right off the bat and say that I am equating rural with environmental or ecological, so that this is not a discussion about a distinction between rural communities and urban communities. This is rather a discussion of the tension or the nexus between urban places or urban spaces and the rural field, as I will call it. So I want to suggest that the foundation of the nexus, the rural-urban nexus, a way to think about that is to think about a rural field upon which we have urban concentrations. So this is a map of Europe showing the population density of all the urban areas, and you can see, yes, there's a lot of urbanization, but it essentially sits in a space which is much more rural or non-urbanized than is urbanized. And similarly, in the United States, you can see that the east coast of the United States is heavily populated, but even there, the space is more rural than urban. And once you get into the Midwest, into the Great Plains, then urbanization is much, much lower. So my first thought that I invite you to kind of embrace is this notion that urban spaces exist within a rural field. And this rural field is our ecological repository. So as Bill alluded to right at the beginning, in terms of the environmental dimension, this rural field is where the land, the water, the fossil fuels, the forests, the fisheries, the climate is largely determined there, biodiversity exists and survives there, and the sequestration of carbon, which is our big concern now in terms of climate change, takes place there. So these natural endowments represent the ecological foundation for society and for the economy. And urban society and economy are ecologically embedded in this rural field. Now this way of thinking is fairly familiar to ecological or environmental economists, so I'll speak of Herman Daly's work, which some of you will be familiar with. He explicitly says that the economy is ecologically embedded and suggests that the old style of thinking about economies as essentially a set of circular relationships is actually a mistake, because in fact economies draw from an ecosystem, what I'm calling the rural field, and in the course of doing that they deplete that ecosystem. So we have a real historical process of relationship between the rural and the urban, if you think of the urban as the economic, and the rural. There's an extraction process or a depletion process here. We do not have circular economies, we have embedded economies. Economies exist within a rural field. And sustainability, if we're going to sustain our ecological existence, requires a stabilization of those extractive relationships and those depletion relationships. I'll power through this slide. I assume that most of you understand are familiar with the ecological footprint, and Bill alluded to it, the trauma's footprint. This is essentially the notion that we can calculate roughly the space that we need in order to supply ourselves with all of the natural resources we need to survive as societies within economies. So all of these things can be calculated, and then we can look at what is the level of production or the level of extraction that is taking place by the consumption economy in relationship to that rural field, and what the group that does the ecological footprint originally developed at UBC in Canada, but now they're based in California. What they're arguing is that our footprint right now is about 1.5 Earths. So we are extracting annually about 1.5 times of what we're able to reproduce in the environment. So this is non-sustainable. And the source for this, and a lot of very good work, is being done by the World Wildlife Fund and its associates, and they report every couple of years in this Living Planet report, so I've drawn from this, and I recommend this to you if you're interested in these issues. So, okay, this is background, essentially trying to set up the environmental relationship. Now I want to bring onto the stage Polanyi, who doesn't really talk that much about the environment, although it is part of his framework, but it's a small part and it's not primarily what's focused on. What Polanyi developed in his most important book done in 1945, The Great Transformation, was Polanyi introduced the notion of the embedded economy. So what Polanyi said is we can think about economies in a fairly standard way. They're about producing goods and services and about consuming goods and services. That's sort of the sense of the circular economy. And so these relationships exist, fair enough. But the institutions that constitute the economy are diverse. So they involve household or subsistence production, reciprocal relations of exchange, redistribution within larger social systems, grain going from stocks out to people that need it, and markets. And the premise of Polanyi's book was that what has happened over the last 100 years, roughly, when he was writing, 150 years when he was writing, 200 years now, is that we've gone through a great transformation in which economies, which used to be a very small part of social relationships, have become the dominant part of social relationships. And what has tended to happen is that we've forgotten that these economies are embedded in much bigger social relationships. So Polanyi's notion of the embedded economy was, yes, we have these economic relationships, but these economic relationships exist within a social set of institutions, relationships, values, and so on, that is much more encompassing. But over time, we've tended to give far more priority to the economic than to the other. So this notion I found very productive. It's very critical of market relationships and the impact of markets. It's an alternative to Marxist approaches of class and technological change. It's more of a cultural approach, but I find it very rich with implications. So some of the things that Polanyi has suggested about market society is that there has been this big transformation, as I've said, but in the course of that transformation, we have kind of been sold a bill of goods. It's been suggested that market society can be self-regulating. He says this is not true. Markets inevitably tend towards instability. So they're not self-regulating. They are unstable. There are lots of market failures of one sort or another, and this was already evident by the Depression of the 1930s, which was a large trigger for Polanyi's work. And most importantly, I think for our purposes, markets cannot make collective decisions. So by letting lots of stuff get done by markets, we're in effect abandoning our ability to make collective decisions, either political decisions. So Polanyi suggested that we have to re-embed the economy. We have to put more energy into thinking about what we want as a society and reducing the influence of the market as a determinant of outcomes. So as I say, I think that's a very important set of ideas, and I encourage you to familiarize yourself with it if you're not familiar with it. But now what I want to do is link up this idea of Polanyi's embeddedness with the environmental discussion that I've just presented. So what we want to do is have a notion of how Polanyi's embedded market is itself embedded within society and then within the ecology. So this is the graphic that I just gave to you. And what I'm suggesting is that we should take Polanyi's idea and we extend it by seeing that the market-society relationships themselves are embedded in this broader ecological set of relationships. So all of the things that I mentioned in the ecology, these are the things that society is embedded within. So we have to worry about the environment in order to get the kinds of social outcomes that we're interested in achieving. So to come back to the rural-urban nexus, the picture that I'm presenting here is that we have rural extraction and rural production, the extraction and production out of this resource base that exists in the rural field. And those resources are being transferred to what is largely an urban consumption, or the urban economy. And the return relationship is one of pollution and despolation. And this is why our footprint is out of whack. So what should we do, or how can we respond to this nexus, sort of following these ideas from Polanyi? Well, I suggest we have to think about two things: sustainability, which we're talking a lot about, and ethics, which we're also talking a lot about, but we often don't put them together. We can have discussions about social ethics over here and discussions about sustainability over there, but it really should be one conversation. So we have to confront market theory, I think, and the sort of dominance of market ideas in policy making with the theories of ecological sustainability and the kinds of empirical work that is being done on the sustainability side, but also with the social relationships that are implied in those ecological relationships. So we have to talk about ecological and social rights, which would be part of the process of re-embedding the economy in a broader set of social relationships. And I want to suggest that this is basically not a struggle over the facts. This is a struggle over values, and it's a struggle over culture. Polanyi at base is a cultural theorist, and he's inviting us to think about historical change as a cultural dynamic. So what are some of the flashpoints that I see? These are just to be suggestive. So we have a lot of talk at this conference about food and food markets and subsistence and local food, CSAs, and a variety of things. Well, there's a basic debate going on between food markets and rights to subsistence. Water markets versus rights to water. Metal markets or resource extraction versus indigenous rights to control of their territories. Fossil fuel markets versus sustainable energy. Carbon markets versus climate change. These are just a few suggestions of the kind of debates that are going on, which really we can understand in terms of this effort to try and re-embed the economy in a broader sense of what social outcomes we want and what ecological outcomes we need, how to protect sustainability. So, and I'm getting close to the end now. How's my time?
Yeah, you're okay.
I'm okay.
Thanks to your others.
So we need a cultural shift in our perception of what is most important. Markets and market relationships are not more important than ecological sustainability, and they're not more important than ecological or social rights. That has been an enculturization that we've undergone that we have to start to correct. We have to get away from these ideas that the economy determines. The economy should not determine, and we shouldn't let it determine. That's Polanyi's message. And so I draw from this in terms of the nexus that I do not think that the urban is more important than the rural. In fact, I think it's exactly the reverse. The urban depends on the rural. The rural is more important than the urban. So if we think a little bit in terms of policy terms, our notions of being embedded ecologically and socially leads to a recognition of the primacy of ecological sustainability as a policy goal, an increased recognition of ecological and social rights in policy formation, both at the national level and internationally in international negotiations. And I would suggest we need socially defined and state administered, because I think we need these larger institutions to enforce these kinds of policies. We need socially defined but state administered programs for the distribution and use of environmental goods and services. So this means we have to substantially reduce the role and our dependence on markets as the form by which we make social decisions. If you ask, I can send you the PDF of this, and I've got a few of the references to it.
Questions about clarification? Constrained clarification. All right, very good, thanks.
Before we start, very quickly, so I know my audience, how many of you are from Canada, live in Canada, or work at a Canadian institution? You're United States? Right, excellent. So we have a diverse group here. So some of what I will be telling you will be, of course, highly contextual to the Canadian context and may or may not be applicable or resonate with some of the concepts, for example, like community capitals coming out of the US. But there's some similarities and some overlap there, although I'm not speaking specifically to community capitals. So I will move fairly quickly because we do want to have some time for my colleagues and I to address your burning questions. But in Canada, at least for the last 15 plus years, the concept of capacity building, and particularly community capacity have been critical, both as a rhetorical tool in public policy, because who doesn't want more capacity or better capacity or increased capacity, but also as a mechanism that is ideologically loaded. I'm very aware of this. I've been part of, in Alberta in particular for the last 7 years, a number of capacity building exercises that as we completed them, we realized that we were in fact explicitly complicit in devolving responsibility to small rural communities under the guise of capacity building, which was actually code for if they can't survive on their own, they don't deserve to survive. So I am aware of this. I'm aware of the ideological nature of the language that I'm using, but it doesn't mean from my standpoint that capacity doesn't have utility as a concept and as an area for intervention, both as an academic and from a policy standpoint. And in particular, when we look to capacity building and the question of community capacity, not just from a measurement standpoint, but from the standpoint of what predicts or influences community capacity, what has emerged is something, and this just worked out so well, evidence that points out that John is wrong.
Great.
Rural is not more important than urban. There, it's a rural sociology conference, I said it. I'll just leave now and sort it out for the next few days. There are some very real questions about how rural and urban spaces, depending on definition, interact. And my particular interest is not just in capacity building, but network theory, how individuals and organizations interact and intersect across this nexus, as we term it. And in particular, what this means for innovation. What does this mean for good and better ideas to move into and onto policy agendas to affect rural community development? Economic, social, environmental, you can use the language of sustainability, resilience, doesn't really matter. How do we get good ideas into rural communities? How do those good ideas gain resonance, traction, and action? How do they become implementable? That's really where we're going with this. So in 2009, I was lucky enough to get provincial funding to run a capacity building program, I told you, funded by the province of Alberta that placed rural interns out into different communities. As part of this, we ran a capacity survey across the entire province of Alberta as a pilot to see what measuring community capacity could look like. We're building on the work of Tom Beckley in New Brunswick, stuff down in the United States, from New Hampshire and elsewhere, to sort of see, well, how might this actually work as part of what was a mandatory benchmarking exercise for this particular internship project. And coming from this were some interesting results that I presented a number of years ago at different conferences, basically pointing to the fact that there are endogenous and exogenous variables at play. There are community characteristics that matter, that are predictors or influencers of community capacity, defined across an index of scores, but there are also endogenous factors, and in Alberta, this is particularly important. For those of you who aren't familiar with Alberta, it is of course characterized by certain American characteristics, settled by a strong American contingent coming up from the US. It has its own form of exceptionalism. It's not the same as Seymour Martin Lipset's exceptionalism, but we're exceptional, so we'll leave it there. We are, of course, heavily oil and gas embedded, And that is creating some very interesting policy challenges, along with a new government who inherited a whole mess of fun ideas and bad policy. But in particular, coming out of these results was the fact that social capital, i.e. social relations, were particularly important, both as endogenous and exogenous factors in predicting community capacity in rural Alberta. We actually had a great response rate. We had a response rate of over 50% to that particular survey. So we have some pretty good validity to those results. Okay.
Just use the slide out.
Or- So this survey was administered originally online and by paper. It was fairly lengthy. This is continuing to prove a challenge. Again, as I mentioned, based in principle upon Tom's work and this amoeba asset model of community capacity. Phase 2, which occurred starting last year, was an attempt to roll this out nationally and to actually see if we could replicate or at least see what the similarities were between our predictors from Alberta and see what the preliminary results told us about a national response. This was administered only online because I'm not made of money. And I will admit we have had some significant issues with the response rate to that particular survey. It's an indicator of capacity in and of itself. I've received many emails and phone calls from mayors, CAOs, chief administrative officers, municipal managers, etc., saying, we just can't answer these questions. We just don't know. I don't have a clue. Can you use your perception? Can you, I can't. I just don't know. I can't. I'm not equipped to answer these questions. But we have developed a broader community capacity indicator. This is consistent from both the first to the second survey, and it's an index of a wide range of questions. None of these are terribly surprising, but it gives us a sense about how we might address two key components of community capacity. And in my shop, we tend to refer to capacity as having two facets: the capacity to decide and the capacity to act. So we're looking not just for action, but also decision-making, but decision-making with a commitment to action. So if we look at the basic results for that indicator from Alberta, you can see a roughly standard distribution. It's slightly above the mean. And we actually had pretty strong responses that a lot of communities in Alberta in 2010, 2011 felt they had good community capacity. That may actually change now. If we were to administer the same survey now, I suspect we would see a lower response rate. When we look to the national data set, it's a little bit more bimodal. You do actually see, and this was a bit of a surprise, we actually had some communities that scored 0. Just 2, but they scored as 0 across a range of indicators. They had functionally no community capacity. Okay, but again, this survey was sent out nationally. When we look at our results, and this is where we'll start to disagree with John, because it's good to start fights on a Thursday afternoon. For Alberta, as you might expect, and originally we didn't understand what the driving causal function of this was, but the presence of the oil sector in a community was a very good predictor of community capacity. Right? But we consider that an exogenous variable because communities can't dictate the location of oil and gas reserves in relation to their geographic position. They can hope, they can pray, they can sacrifice goats, but that doesn't really help. At the same time, we had lots of endogenous factors like a willingness of the community to collaborate, the openness of the community to newcomers and new ideas, distance from the corridor. In Alberta, between the Calgary, Edmonton, Red Deer corridor, there are many communities that are within about 90 minutes drive. And so in Canada, we have what's called the Metropolitan Influence Zone as a StatsCan indicator, right? That helps capture some of this dynamic. The people are moving very much between these bedroom and commuter communities into these larger urban spaces. But we realized as we started to look at this in other results that the oil industry, although it's reviled and comes with all kinds of costs, may actually be playing a positive role. What could that positive role be? Because when we speak, and I speak with representatives from many small communities that have highly transient populations, they have essentially what they refer to as absentee fathers, they have the oil moms or the single or the new housewives of the oil sector in Alberta, highly affluent, not working, A lot of children driving expensive cars, spending lots of money, but also there are social problems. You may be familiar with some of the issues in Fort McMurray before it got unfortunately burned mostly to the ground around drug use, alcoholism, violence, prostitution, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we tend to frame the oil industry in a very negative light. But what does the oil industry do from an innovation and a social network standpoint? In Alberta, it has served to bring different people. It has brought heterogeneity into these communities. It has served, for lack of better language, as a proxy or as a form of bridging social capital. That's our best explanation. From a network theory standpoint, it's actually helping bring new ideas, particularly when you look at what some of these other factors are. Places is an indicator based upon informal places to meet and communicate. Coffee shops, street corners, open streets. These informal dynamics coupled with people who are bringing in new ideas who may only be there for 18 months, may only be there for 6 months, might be there for 3 years, may actually have helped to bolster, albeit artificially, the resilience or the capacity of Albertan communities. When we look at our national data, and again, the N on these are quite small, so please do take these with a grain of salt. What we see is, again, informal meeting places matter. Having these spaces for not only bridging, but also perhaps bonding social capital to take place are in fact important. Again, this is not like earth-shaking news, I think, to anyone here, but empirically to see this, particularly when at the national scale, when we see the distance to corridor, the oil industry, those things don't matter, but openness to new ideas and willingness for intermunicipal collaboration matters. It means that those communities that have high scores of capacity are in fact connected. They do have a network dynamic out to other communities, whether it's other rural communities, and in many cases, of course, it's going to be, if they're proximate, into urban spaces. Urban spaces, in contrast to the ecological model that John is providing, are in fact not just extracting from rural communities. They may be, if the circumstances are right, putting back into rural communities. And if they're not, this creates a very real policy challenge.
Before you leave that, what does the negative one for openness mean?
Negative one for openness.
The
Negative coefficient.
negative
Yeah,
one?
it's gone the other way.
Oh, it's coded the other way.
Yeah. So same with population. Population isn't significant. When we started to drill down to the capacity indicator, we had a 5-sectoral breakdown of that indicator. What we saw again was that these two factors were critical in Alberta. They were predictors across the range, right? Oil sector and distance to the corridor. And if you've been to Alberta, if you've worked in that sector, it kind of makes sense. We've got basically a regional hub, which at one point they were anticipating was going to go to 6 million plus people. And then we literally have a core and a periphery. When we look at the national results, we really only see one really important predictor. That is openness to newcomers and to new ideas. I.e., what we have happening is, again, an explanation around community capacity that hinges on bridging social capital. But this has real implications given some of these other factors, like, being a good place to raise kids, ironically, can influence your leadership. Education, doesn't matter. Distance to corridors or distance to urban spaces doesn't matter. The question that emerges then, and this is sort of my final point as we move into the discussion of this, is what are the implications of this as a factor for a predictor of community capacity? What does it mean from a policy standpoint? From an Albertan standpoint, we have the question of, as the oil sector and the oil and gas sector potentially declines or remains stagnant, we see people literally staying home, 70,000 plus staying home. Will this in the long term have negative effects upon community capacity in rural areas? Beyond just the affluence and the money and the sheer wealth that was being spent by these communities. What are the implications of not actually moving people between these different communities? And I don't want to overestimate or overstate, knowing and having worked in the oil sector, we're not talking about moving a whole bunch of sociologists, economists, etc. We're talking about rig people, we're we're talking about hired labor, we're talking in some cases about highly educated, but often very poorly educated individuals who are moving between communities, but there is a dynamic there. As a side, Alberta has the lowest high school completion rate in the country. Just when I say poorly educated, I mean that empirically. When we look nationally, what do we think about the role of social capital, in particular when coupled with the concept of bridging social capital and the concept of homophily? How many of you are familiar with the concept of homophily? Right? It's a network theory concept which is actually empirically well demonstrated, and it basically is like clusters with like. If you're on Facebook, you are probably experiencing, if not contributing to, homophily. Very rarely do Republicans follow a lot of Democrat parties on Facebook, and so forth, right? But this network dynamic extends far beyond social media. And we're seeing increasing evidence that it actually has significant implications in terms of how communities respond to new ideas coming in. Because as like clusters with like, as we know, if you have high levels of bonding social capital and intermittent inputs from outside through your network, you are in fact more resistant to these new ideas. And so from a policy standpoint, I think the question becomes, how do we foster openness to newcomers and new ideas as an intervention to bolster capacity and resilience in rural communities? How do we foster those linkages and acknowledge the linkages that are coming from urban, but also from other rural spaces that lead to innovative ideas, that lead to innovative programming, that lead to new business ventures, new social ventures, new regionalized collaboratives? How do we structure governance in this same context? These are some of the questions that Alberta is now starting to struggle with. And in particular, as we look to smaller communities, what are the implications for the smallest of small communities, given the tension between homophily and the potential importance of openness to newcomers and new ideas? So I think with that, I'll leave it. Thank you.
Clarification questions? Yes.
Just to clarify, what is your definition of a community capacity, and how does that relate to resilience? You didn't start off with like a definition.
So the simple definition is the capacity to decide and the capacity to act. Empirically, it's based on an index of 21, the survey is different slightly, we modified the survey. It's 21 different indicators that have been drawn from other surveys to basically be consistent with how you might measure community capacity. But from my standpoint, I always define capacity as the ability to make a decision, preferably evidence-informed, but that's a bias, but followed by also the ability to act upon that decision in a short, medium, and preferably long-term way.
As a community.
A municipality, it gets fuzzy in Canada because technically we don't have communities, we have municipalities, we have all kinds of different municipalities, we have all kinds of different arrangements around what they are.
And does that relate to resilience?
I think it can, and it should. I tend to embed it more in the context of sustainability and the governance institute, or the governance pillar of sustainability. But one can see that if you're thinking about resilience from an adaptive standpoint, then I would think that the ability to incorporate and adapt means having new ideas and being able to incorporate and act upon those new ideas. So it could very much contribute to resilience depending on your conception.
So I was wondering, when you're talking about innovation, are you talking about social or technical innovation, or are you talking about both? And when you're talking about capacity building, you talked a lot about the influx of people coming into these communities, bringing new ideas and networking. Did you see any evidence of social movement opposition and that creating capacity within those communities?
Second question, no. My experience has been, there are more people, they're going to pay more taxes, this is all good. I've never seen, there are some small communities, there's a rhetorical art, it's called an artifact, where politically there is, in some areas, resistance to newcomers. I live in the Maritimes, Atlantic Canada, and it's called come from away dynamic. right? You're never from there, you can live there for 7 generations, you're still gonna come from away, but you're not necessarily ostracized, there isn't resistance to you, you're just not part of the community in the same way. Some communities in Alberta have resistance to urban spaces, but it's largely driven, I think, by the policy tools that the government's used over the last 30, 40 years, where they've pitted municipalities against each other. And as the pots have dried up, they found that in the name of capacity building, it's much easier to say, we're building your capacity to compete for these funds. And so rural communities are now going, well, how do you compete as a community of 1,700 with the city of 1.3 million? That's a slightly different dynamic. Is that? Okay.
Hey, I invite the speakers to come up and we can, hopefully